A racist teen spits on a black kid in front of his whole school, and the entire world sees it. Within hours, his town turns against him. His friends vanish, his father explodes, and his future is in ruins. But instead of jail or expulsion, he's sent somewhere no one would expect. A rundown garage run by 15 old Hell's Angels, men with scars, tattoos, and stories darker than his own. He thinks it's punishment until they start teaching him something his father never did: respect, mercy, and what real strength looks like. But when the law turns on these bikers and his own family demands he stay silent, this teen faces an impossible choice: protect his pride or defend the men who changed his soul. Because sometimes, the ones society fears most are the only ones who know how to save it. Can the boy who spread hate become the man who stands for love? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The air hung thick and heavy in the hallways of Riverside High that Thursday morning, matching the weight in George Walsh's chest. He strutted down the corridor like he owned it, his footsteps echoing against the worn linoleum floors. His father's words from breakfast still rang in his ears. "A Walsh holds his head high. We're better than most folks in this town." Students parted before him like water around a rock. George had perfected that walk over the years, shoulders back, chin lifted, just like his father taught him. The police chief's son couldn't show weakness. Ever. The morning bell had just rung, sending streams of teenagers hurrying to their first classes. George took his time, knowing teachers rarely marked him tardy. The perks of being Chief Walsh's son. Then it happened. Malik Thompson, carrying a stack of textbooks, rounded the corner near the water fountain. Neither boy saw the other until it was too late. Their shoulders collided, sending Malik's books scattering across the floor. "I'm sorry," Malik said quickly, already bending to gather his belongings. "Didn't see you there." Something hot and ugly stirred in George's gut. He'd heard his father's muttered comments at the dinner table about certain people not knowing their place. Seen the way the chief's jaw tightened whenever Malik's Uncle Ryder drove past in his motorcycle. All the small moments of prejudice he'd absorbed over the years bubbled to the surface. The hallway had grown quiet. Dozens of eyes watched, waiting. George felt them all on him, expecting something. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Never let them think you're weak." "Watch where you're going," George snarled, but Malik just continued picking up his books, his movements calm and deliberate. That composure made George's blood boil. Without thinking, he felt the hatred rise in his throat like bile. He spat, a glob of saliva landing on Malik's shoulder. Then the word came out, ugly and sharp, a racial slur that seemed to freeze the air itself. The hallway went dead silent. Then came the subtle sounds of cell phones being raised, their camera apps opening with soft clicks. Malik slowly stood, his face a mask of dignified pain. He looked George directly in the eyes, and in that gaze, George saw something that made his stomach lurch. Not anger or hatred, but disappointment. As if Malik had expected better of him. "That's who you want to be?" Malik asked quietly, before turning and walking away. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispers and sideways glances. By lunch period, the video had already hit social media. George watched his notification count climb, each ping feeling like another nail in his coffin. Evening found him sitting at the dinner table, pushing food around his plate while his mother, Ellen, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Chief Raymond Walsh burst through the front door at 6:45, his face thunderous. He didn't even remove his gun belt before starting in. What the hell were you thinking? He roared, throwing his phone onto the table. The video played again, George's actions now seeming even more horrible in the quiet of their dining room. Do you have any idea what you've done? To yourself? To this family's reputation? Dad, George started, but the chief cut him off. Don't you dare try to justify this. His father's face had turned an alarming shade of red. I've spent 25 years building respect in this community. 25 years, and you destroy it in 20 seconds? Ellen dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Raymond, please. No, Ellen. He needs to hear this. The chief leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. You've embarrassed this family. You've embarrassed me. George felt his defenses rise. He bumped into me, and you're always saying how they… Stop right there! His father slammed a hand on the table, making the plates jump. Don't you dare try to pin this on me. This is all you, son. All you. The words stung, mostly because George knew there was truth in them. He had chosen to act, chosen to let that hatred out. But admitting that felt impossible, so he straightened his shoulders and tried to match his father's glare. Whatever, he muttered. It's not that big a deal. His mother's soft crying grew louder, and George felt shame twist in his gut. He wanted to take it all back. The spitting, the slur, this moment right here. But pride kept him rigid in his chair. The chief's phone rang, breaking the tense silence. George watched his father's face darken further as he answered it. Yes, sir. Yes, I understand. No, sir, this isn't… Yes, I'll handle it. He ended the call and fixed George with a cold stare. That was the school board. You're suspended indefinitely. What? They can't? They can, and they have. His father stood up, his dinner untouched. And right now, I don't have it in me to fight for you on this one. You earned this, George, every bit of it. George watched his father stride from the room, his mother hurrying after him. Left alone at the table, he could finally let his carefully constructed wall crack. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him like a physical thing. He thought of Malik's face in that moment after the slur. Not angry, just disappointed. Thought of his mother's tears, his father's shame. The sick feeling in his stomach grew stronger. His phone buzzed again. Another notification about the video. Another reminder of his choices. George switched it off and pushed his plate away, no longer hungry. The house felt too quiet now, filled with the echoes of his father's anger and his mother's sobs. In his 16 years, George had never felt more alone, or more deserving of that loneliness. As night settled over their small Georgia town, he sat there in the dimming light, understanding for the first time that some words couldn't be taken back, some actions couldn't be undone, and some mistakes would follow you long after the video stopped trending. The weight of consequence pressed down on him, heavier than the humid air outside, heavier than all his father's expectations. And somewhere in the darkness of his mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the person he'd thought he was, or the person he wanted to be. Morning sunlight crept through George's bedroom window, accompanied by an unfamiliar sound. At first he thought it was distant traffic, but as consciousness fully took hold, he recognized the steady drone of voices. Many voices. He pushed aside his curtain and froze. At least 50 people stood on their normally quiet street, holding signs and chanting. Some carried posters with his face, screenshots from the video, with words like, "Hate has no home here," and "Racism stops with us," painted in bold letters. "George," his mother's voice called from downstairs, "stay away from the windows." He let the curtain fall back into place, his heart pounding. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not in their town. Downstairs, his mother paced the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, I understand. No, we won't be able to make it to church this Sunday." "I know, Helen, I know." She hung up and pressed her fingers to her temples. George had never seen her look so tired. "That's the third church board member to call," she said quietly. "They think it's best if we take a break from services for a while." The shame that had been gnawing at George's insides grew sharper. His mother lived for their church community. Now she was being pushed out because of him. His father burst through the back door, his uniform already sweat-stained despite the early hour. "The station's been flooded with calls. News vans are setting up down the street." He fixed George with a hard stare. "This isn't going away, son." George's phone buzzed. Another message from a former friend. "Way to go, racist." Meanwhile, across town, Malik Thompson's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Support poured in from everywhere. Local civil rights groups, community leaders, even national organizations. His Uncle Ryder's garage was filled with flower deliveries and cards. But Malik just sat quietly in his room, staring at his hands. He didn't want to be a symbol or a cause. He just wanted to finish high school, work on cars, and live his life. Back at the Walsh house, Chief Raymond paced the living room like a caged animal. The protesters' chants grew louder, punctuated by car horns from supportive passing vehicles. "We need to get ahead of this," the chief muttered, more to himself than his family. He'd been making calls all morning, pulling every string he could reach. Finally, one had caught. "I've arranged something," he announced. "An alternative to the suspension." George looked up from his phone, hopeful for the first time since yesterday. "There's a local charity group, the Southern Brotherhood Riders. They do community outreach, charity runs, that sort of thing." The chief's jaw tightened. "You'll do 3 months of community service with them, starting today." George let out a sharp laugh. "Bikers? Seriously?" "This isn't a joke, George." His father's voice cracked like a whip. "It's this, or you can sit at home while your entire future circles the drain. Your choice." 2 hours later, George sat in the passenger seat of his father's police cruiser, watching the town give way to dusty outskirts. They pulled up to a sprawling garage complex where 15 motorcycles gleamed in the Georgia sun. 3 months, his father reminded him. "Don't make me regret this." George stepped out of the car, trying to maintain his usual swagger despite the knot in his stomach. 15 men stood watching him, massive guys covered in leather and tattoos. They looked exactly like the kind of people his father usually arrested. A tall man with gray-streaked hair stepped forward. His face was weathered, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "You must be George," he said quietly. "I'm Ryder." Without another word, he handed George a broom. The message was clear. Start sweeping. The day stretched endlessly. George swept every inch of the massive garage, lifted boxes until his arms shook, and washed bikes until his fingers pruned. Not one of the bikers spoke to him. They just watched, their silence more unnerving than any threat could have been. By mid-afternoon, frustration got the better of him. "This is stupid," he muttered, throwing down the rag he'd been using to polish chrome. "You can't make me do this." A mountain of a man stepped forward. His arms were covered in tattoos. Bible verses, George realized, inked over what looked like old gang marks. "Name's Saint," the man said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "And nobody's making you do anything, son. You're choosing to be here, same as you chose what you did yesterday." The quiet disappointment in Saint's eyes hit George harder than any angry words could have. He picked up the rag and went back to work. When his father's cruiser finally returned at sunset, George could barely walk. Every muscle screamed. His clothes were soaked with sweat and stained with grease. He'd never worked so hard in his life. "How was it?" the chief asked as they pulled away. George stared out the window at the receding garage. The bikers were still there, watching. They looked dangerous. They looked capable of anything. "Fine," he lied, trying to keep his voice steady. But inside, fear coiled like a cold snake. 3 months suddenly felt like a life sentence. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his seatbelt. The physical exhaustion was bad enough, but it was the silence that really got to him. The weight of 15 pairs of eyes watching his every move, judging him without a word. He had no idea how he was going to survive this punishment, or if he'd even make it out in one piece. The garage disappeared around a bend, but George could still feel those eyes on him. He had a feeling they'd be haunting his dreams tonight, along with the endless sweep of that broom across concrete and the quiet, devastating disappointment in Saint's gaze. The rest of the drive home passed in silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the police radio and the sound of George's own ragged breathing. Each inhale carried the lingering scent of motor oil and metal, a reminder that tomorrow he'd have to do it all over again. The next 7 days blurred together in a haze of aching muscles and endless tasks. George's alarm jolted him awake at 4:30. Each morning, long before the Georgia sun thought about rising. His mother stopped trying to make conversation over breakfast, just silently packed him a lunch he rarely had the appetite to eat. The compound looked different in the pre-dawn darkness, more threatening somehow, with shadows pooling between the parked motorcycles and the metal walls of the garage seeming to loom higher. Every morning, Ryder waited by the entrance, as steady and unmovable as a mountain. "Supply run," he'd say one day. "Soup kitchen," the next. Never more words than necessary. On Tuesday, they loaded boxes of donated food into rumbling trucks. George's arms trembled as he lifted crate after crate, but none of the bikers offered help. They just watched with those same quiet, measuring eyes. Wednesday found them delivering supplies to elderly widows on the outskirts of town. George trailed behind the group, watching as these huge, intimidating men transformed at each doorstep. They spoke softly, called everyone ma'am, and remembered details about grandchildren and doctor's appointments that George would never have thought to track. At one small house, paint peeling from its wooden sides, a biker named Bear, 6'5" with knuckle tattoos and a graying beard, knelt down to fix a squeaking wheelchair. His massive hands moved with surprising delicacy as he adjusted the wheels. "There you go, Miss Martha," he rumbled, helping the tiny woman settle back into her seat. "Should roll smooth as silk now." "Bless you, dear." She patted his weathered cheek like he was her own grandson. "You boys are angels, every one of you." George hung back, something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. These weren't the dangerous criminals his father always warned about. These weren't the thugs he'd expected to meet. Thursday brought them to the downtown soup kitchen. George stirred massive pots of stew while watching the bikers interact with the homeless people who shuffled through the line. Each person got a smile, a kind word, often a name greeting that spoke of long familiarity. Near noon, a little girl's wail cut through the general murmur. George looked up to see a child, no more than 6 years old, spinning in panicked circles by the door. "Mama?" Her voice cracked with tears. "Mama?" Before anyone else could move, a biker named Crash stepped forward. His neck was covered in prison tattoos, and his knuckles bore the marks of too many fights. But he dropped to one knee, putting himself at the girl's eye level. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said gently. "Let's find your mama together, okay?" The girl stared at him, tears still tracking down her dirty cheeks. Crash just waited patiently, holding out one scarred hand. After a moment, she took it. 10 minutes later, They returned with a relieved-looking woman in tow. The girl's mother hugged her daughter tight, then surprised George by hugging Crash, too. "Thank you," she whispered. "Most people would have just walked past." Crash shrugged, embarrassed by the gratitude. "Brotherhood means looking out for everybody, ma'am, not just our own." During the lunch break, George sat alone as usual, picking at his sandwich. Two bikers, Saint and an older man called Preacher, settled at a nearby table. They didn't acknowledge George, but their voices carried clearly in the quiet room. "Anniversary's coming up," Preacher said softly. 23 years since Khe-san." Saint nodded. "Lost some good men there." "Lost myself, too, for a while." Preacher's weathered fingers traced the cross hanging from his neck. "Took me years to find my way back to the light. Sometimes I think the only reason I survived was so I could help others find their way, too." "Amen to that, brother." Saint's voice grew distant. "War shows you the worst humanity's capable of, but it also shows you how much grace matters, how much mercy matters." George's sandwich turned to ash in his mouth. Grace. Mercy. The words echoed in his head, bringing with them an unwanted image. Malik's face in that school hallway, the moment before George's hatred spilled over. He'd seen shock there, and hurt, but no answering anger. No desire for revenge. That night, lying in his bed, George couldn't sleep. The ceiling fan spun lazy circles above him, but his mind spun faster. He kept seeing things he couldn't unsee. Bear's gentle hands fixing that wheelchair, Crash comforting that lost child, the quiet understanding between those Vietnam vets who'd found purpose in helping others. His father's voice rang in his memory. Just criminals pretending to be decent. But George had seen their decency firsthand now. He'd watched them serve others without asking anything in return. They weren't pretending. They were living something real, something that made his own actions seem smaller and meaner with each passing day. The moment in the hallway played again in his mind. His own face twisted with sudden rage, the arc of spittle through the air, the terrible silence that followed. Shame burned in his chest, heavy and hot. He rolled onto his side, trying to escape it, but the feeling followed. For the first time, George truly saw his actions through others' eyes. He saw himself not as the wronged party, not as someone defending his pride, but as exactly what he was. A boy letting hatred poison his heart. The realization sat like lead in his stomach, keeping sleep at bay until the first hints of dawn began to creep through his window. The bikers hadn't spoken more than 10 words to him all week, but somehow their actions, their quiet strength, their unexpected gentleness, their commitment to serving others, had said more than words ever could. George lay there in the growing light, knowing he would never see the world quite the same way again. The heaviness in his chest wasn't going away. But maybe, he thought as his alarm began to buzz, that weight was exactly what he needed to feel. Maybe it was the first step toward becoming someone different, someone better, than the boy who had spit on a classmate in a moment of blind hatred. Saturday morning dawned bright and humid, typical for Georgia in late spring. George arrived at the garage earlier than usual, his muscles already aching from the week's work. The Southern Brotherhood riders had a big food drive planned, and white boxes filled with canned goods lined the walls. "Start sorting these by type," Bear instructed, pointing to a mountain of donations. "Vegetables, fruits, meats, soups. Stack 'em neat." George nodded, falling into the familiar rhythm of work. His hands moved mechanically while his mind wandered. The past week had changed something in him, though he couldn't quite name what. The silence of the bikers, their quiet acts of kindness. It all felt like a lesson he was slowly beginning to understand. The rumble of motorcycles outside announced more arrivals. George barely looked up anymore at the sound, too focused on organizing cans of green beans into tidy rows. But then the garage door creaked open, and a familiar voice made his heart stop. "Morning, Uncle Ryder." George's head snapped up so fast his neck cracked. There, walking through the door beside the chapter's leader, was Malik Thompson. The same Malik he'd spit on just days ago. The same Malik whose face had haunted his sleepless nights. The can of beans slipped from George's suddenly numb fingers, clattering loudly on the concrete floor. The sound drew both Malik's and Ryder's attention. Malik froze, his easy smile vanishing as he recognized George. The garage seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker. Ryder's expression remained unreadable as his gaze moved between the two boys. "Malik," he said calmly, "this is George Walsh. He's helping us out for a while." Then, turning to George, he added, "Malik's my sister's boy, family." The word family hit George like a physical blow. All this time he'd been working under the uncle of the very person he'd wronged. His mouth went dry as understanding crashed over him. Ryder had known. He'd known everything. I'm sorry," George stammered, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "About what happened at school, Stop." Ryder's voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough authority to silence George instantly. "You'll learn forgiveness with your hands, not your mouth. Actions mean more than words ever will." George swallowed hard and nodded, bending down to retrieve the fallen can. When he straightened up, Malik had already moved to another stack of boxes, methodically sorting through their contents. The tension in his shoulders was visible even from across the room. The morning passed in a blur of activity. More bikers arrived, forming a human chain to move boxes from delivery trucks into the garage. George and Malik worked at opposite ends of the space, but George couldn't help stealing glances. Each time he did, shame burned a little hotter in his chest. Malik worked steadily, efficiently, speaking easily with the bikers who clearly knew him well. This was his world, George realized. These men weren't strangers to him. They were family. Around noon, Bear called for a lunch break. George sat alone as usual, unwrapping his sandwich with trembling fingers. To his surprise, Malik approached, holding his own lunch bag. "Mind if I sit?" Malik's voice was quiet but steady. George shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. Malik settled onto the bench, leaving careful space between them. They ate in silence for several minutes before Malik spoke again. "I didn't tell Uncle Ryder, about what happened." He kept his eyes on his food. "He saw the video himself. Never said a word to me about it, but next thing I knew, you were here." George's sandwich felt like lead in his stomach. "He's been teaching me lessons without saying anything all week. That's Uncle Ryder." The ghost of a smile touched Malik's lips. "He believes in letting people figure things out for themselves." The afternoon brought a new task. Bike maintenance. George was struggling with a stubborn chain when Malik appeared beside him, tools in hand. Without speaking, he demonstrated the proper technique for fixing the link. Their fingers were black with grease, but the silence between them felt different now, less hostile, more thoughtful. When George finally arrived home that evening, his father was waiting in the kitchen. Chief Walsh's face was tight with barely contained anger. "I heard you've been working with that Thompson boy," he spat. "What are you doing mixing with those people?" The words hit George like a slap. A week ago, he might have nodded along, might have shared his father's anger. But now, remembering Crash comforting the lost child, Bear fixing the widow's wheelchair, Malik quietly showing him how to repair a bike chain. His father's anger felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. George stood there in his grease-stained clothes, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he hesitated to agree with his father. The words wouldn't come. Instead, he felt the slow burn of shame, not for working with those people, but for ever having thought of them that way in the first place. The silence stretched between father and son, filled with questions neither was ready to ask, and answers neither was prepared to hear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the garage as Ryder approached George, who was organizing tools on the workbench. "Got something different planned today," Ryder said, his weathered face thoughtful. "We're doing our monthly food delivery run. Want you to come along?" George's hands stilled on the wrench he'd been cleaning. "The whole route?" Ryder nodded. 2 days, 12 stops. You'll ride in the supply van with Saint." He must have noticed George's nervous glance at the motorcycles lined up outside, because he added, "Don't worry, you're not ready for 2 wheels yet." An hour later, George found himself in the passenger seat of a white van, watching 15 motorcycles roar to life in front of them. Saint, behind the wheel, caught George's wide-eyed expression and chuckled. "First time seeing the whole crew roll out, huh?" The bikers formed a perfect V formation as they pulled onto the highway, their chrome gleaming in the morning light. The van followed behind, loaded with boxes of food and supplies. George watched the townspeople's reactions as they passed. Some waved, others stared, but there was none of the fear or disgust he'd expected. At their first stop, a small church in a run-down neighborhood, people were already waiting. Children bounced excitedly as the motorcycles pulled up, and elderly women embraced the bikers like long-lost sons. George helped unload boxes, watching in amazement as these tough-looking men gently assisted frail seniors and joked with kids. "They know us here," Saint explained as they drove to the next location. "Been doing this route for 15 years. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Wasn't always like this, though." George glanced at the older man's tattooed arms, noticing for the first time that some of the designs were covering older ones. "What changed?" Saint's fingers drummed on the steering wheel. "Mind if I tell you a story, kid? Might help you understand some things." When George nodded, Saint began speaking, his voice low and steady against the hum of the engine. "I wasn't always Saint. Used to be called something else, something that matched what I was. Spent 20 years of my life thinking power came from making people fear me. Drugs, violence, you name it. Ended up doing 20 years behind bars for things I ain't proud of." He paused as they turned onto a country road, following the line of motorcycles ahead. "Found God in prison, but not like you might think. Wasn't no lightning bolt moment. Was more like a slow dawn, you know? Started with one act of kindness from someone I'd wronged. Made me question everything." George thought about Malik showing him how to fix the bike chain. How did you change?" Saint smiled. "Here's something I learned. God doesn't clean his fish before he catches them. He takes us as we are, mess and all. Then the cleaning starts, but it's a process. Takes time, takes help." At their next stop, a trailer park on the outskirts of town, a small boy with untied shoelaces ran up to George. "You're the helper," he exclaimed, beaming. "I saw you at the garage last week." George felt something shift inside him as he smiled back, his first real smile in weeks. He knelt down to tie the boy's shoes, just as he'd seen Saint do for another child days before. The day continued, stop after stop, each one showing George a different side of his community. He saw poverty he'd never noticed before, courage he'd never appreciated, and kindness he'd never expected. The bikers knew everyone's names, asked about sick relatives, celebrated small victories with each family they visited. As evening approached, they made camp in a clearing by a lake. The bikers built a fire, and the smell of coffee and cooking food filled the air. George sat on a log, watching the flames dance, when Ryder settled beside him. "Time for some stories," Ryder announced, and the other bikers gathered around. In the firelight, their faces looked different to George. Weathered but wise, marked by life but softened by compassion. Ryder spoke of brothers lost, some to war, some to the streets, some to their own demons. He told of how the Southern Brotherhood Riders had started, born from a promise made by Vietnam veterans to live differently, to serve instead of destroy. "We lost Tommy 2 years ago," Ryder said, his voice thick with memory. "Cancer took him quick, but before he went, he made us promise to keep serving. Said it was the only thing that ever made him feel whole again after the war." George listened, mesmerized by tales of redemption and second chances. These men had seen darkness. Some had been the darkness, but they'd chosen a different path. He thought about his own anger, how small and hollow it seemed now. The stories continued as the fire burned low. One by one, the bikers retired to their tents, until only the crickets and distant owls provided accompaniment to Ryder's words. George felt his eyes growing heavy, but he fought to stay awake, not wanting to miss a single story. Finally, Ryder stood and handed George a sleeping bag. "Rest up, son. We've got more deliveries tomorrow." George unrolled the sleeping bag near the dying fire, looking up at the vast expanse of stars above. The rumble of distant trucks on the highway reminded him of motorcycles, a sound that had once meant danger, but now spoke of brotherhood and purpose. As sleep began to claim him, George thought about strength, not the kind that came from fear or dominance, but the quiet strength he'd seen today, the strength to serve, to show mercy, to change. The sound of crickets merged with his thoughts, and he drifted off under the starlit sky, feeling, for the first time in weeks, at peace with himself. The night wrapped around him like a blanket, and the last thing he heard before sleep took him completely was the far-off rumble of a motorcycle, fading into the darkness like a lullaby. The morning sun beat down on the grocery store parking lot as George helped unload boxes of donated food. His muscles ached from sleeping on the ground, but it was a good kind of sore. The kind that came from honest work. He was stacking cans when he heard the sneers. 2 boys from his school, Brad Mitchell and Tony Peters, stood near the store entrance, their voices carrying across the lot. "Look who it is! The mechanic's charity case!" Brad called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Tony snickered beside him. George's head snapped up. Through the store window, he could see Malik inside, pretending to study the cereal boxes. But George recognized the tension in his shoulders, the way his head dipped lower with each comment. Old instincts kicked in. Walk away. Don't get involved. It's not your problem. The thoughts came automatically, like muscle memory from years of standing by, staying silent. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Keep your head down. Don't make waves." But something else stirred in his chest, the memory of Saint's words by the campfire, of Ryder's quiet strength, of countless small acts of kindness he'd witnessed over the past weeks. Malik's shoulders hunched further as Brad and Tony's taunts continued. George saw his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the shopping basket. Something inside George snapped. Before he knew what he was doing, he was moving. 3 long strides took him between the bullies and the store entrance. He planted his feet, squared his shoulders, just like he'd seen Saint do when facing down trouble. "You got a problem," George said, his voice steady and clear. "You got it with me." Brad's sneer faltered. Tony took a half step back. They'd expected the old George, the one who would have joined their mockery, maybe even led it. Instead, they faced someone different, someone whose eyes held the kind of certainty, that comes from finding your truth. "Since when are you defending him?" Brad demanded, but his voice had lost its edge. "Since I learned what real strength looks like," George replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The bullies exchanged glances, their bravado deflating. They muttered something about being late and skulked away, leaving George standing guard at the entrance. Behind him, the automatic doors swished open. Malik stepped out, his eyes meeting George's briefly before dropping to the ground. "Thanks," Malik mumbled, shifting his grocery bag from one hand to the other. George wanted to say more, wanted to apologize again, to explain how different things looked now, to bridge the gulf between them. But he remembered Ryder's words. "You'll earn forgiveness with your hands, not your mouth." So he just nodded and went back to stacking cans. Word spread fast in their small town. By afternoon, when George returned to the garage, the story had reached the bikers. He felt their eyes on him as he worked, but it was different now. Gone was the wary disappointment. Instead, he caught nods of approval, small gestures of respect. Saint clapped him on the shoulder as they cleaned tools. "Heard what you did," he said simply. "Good man." The praise warmed George more than any of his father's previous proud speeches about his baseball games or grades. This felt real, earned through action rather than appearance. But the warmth didn't last. When George got home that evening, his father was waiting in the living room, face dark with anger. "What's this I hear about you causing trouble at the grocery store?" Chief Walsh demanded. George straightened his spine. "I wasn't causing trouble, I was stopping it." "By defending that Thompson boy, getting involved in their business?" His father's voice rose. "Those bikers are filling your head with trash." "They're not trash," George shot back, surprising himself with his vehemence. "They're veterans. They help people. They show up when nobody else will. They're criminals, ex-cons, and you're spending time with them, letting them influence you. They're better men than you." The words burst from George before he could stop them, raw and real. The silence that followed was deafening. His father's face turned purple with rage. "You're grounded," Chief Walsh growled. "And you're done with this community service nonsense. I forbid you from going back there." "You can't do that. I'm your father, and you'll do as I say." The chief slammed his hand on the coffee table. "Those people are beneath us. I won't have my son mixing with their kind." George stared at his father, really stared at him for the first time. He saw the fear behind the anger, the weakness behind the bluster. This man he'd idolized, whose approval he'd craved for so long, suddenly seemed small. Later that night, George lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet except for the tick of the hallway clock and the distant sound of his father's TV downstairs. His mind raced with images from the past weeks, Saint kneeling to help a child, Ryder's quiet dignity, the grateful faces of people they'd helped. Then he thought of his father's face tonight, twisted with prejudice and fear. The man who'd taught him about strength and respect now seemed to understand neither. Chief Walsh had built his authority on making others feel small, on divisions and suspicion. He'd constructed his life on fear, not faith. George rolled onto his side, his heart heavy but his mind clear. The grounding didn't matter. His father's approval didn't matter. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly who he wanted to be, and it wasn't his father's son. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, George understood something fundamental had shifted inside him. The bikers hadn't just taught him about service, they'd shown him what real strength looked like. It looked like standing up for what's right, even when it costs you something. It looked like choosing kindness over fear, bridge building over walls. Sleep eluded him as he lay there. But the darkness didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt like possibility. Dawn hadn't quite broken when George slipped out his bedroom window. The morning air felt thick with humidity, and dew dampened his sneakers as he cut across his neighbor's lawn. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from the exertion of sneaking out, but from defying his father's direct orders. The streets were empty this early, just the occasional delivery truck rumbling past. George walked quickly, keeping to the shadows out of habit, though he knew his father wouldn't be patrolling this route. The police chief preferred to stick to the more affluent parts of town. When he reached the compound, the sun had barely crested the horizon. The familiar smell of oil and leather greeted him as he approached the garage. A few bikes were already parked outside, their chrome catching the early light. Ryder stood in the doorway, as if he'd been expecting him. His weathered face gave nothing away as George approached. "Sir, George started, but Ryder held up a hand. "Inside," he said simply. The garage was quiet this early. Only the buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant coffee pot percolating broke the silence. Ryder led him to the small office in the back, gesturing for George to sit in the creaky wooden chair across from his desk. "Your father called last night," Ryder said, settling into his own chair. "Said you're grounded. Said you're not to come back here." George's throat felt tight. "I know, sir, but I couldn't. I had to." "You had to disobey your father?" Ryder's voice remained neutral, but his eyes were intense. "He's wrong," George burst out. "Everything he believes, everything he taught me, it's all wrong. The way he talks about people, the way he judges everyone." "Maybe so." Ryder nodded slowly. "But he's still your father." "But, listen to me, son." Ryder leaned forward. "You must honor your father even when your father is wrong." George felt tears burning behind his eyes. "How? How can I honor someone when everything they stand for goes against what's right?" "By being better," Ryder said simply. "By showing him another way. Dishonoring him won't heal anything. It'll just create more darkness." The tears spilled over then, and George couldn't stop them. Weeks of guilt, fear, and confusion poured out of him. "I'm so ashamed," he choked out, "of what I did to Malik, of who I was, of believing all those things my dad taught me. I'm scared I'll never be different enough, never be good enough." Ryder stood and came around the desk, placing a heavy hand on George's shoulder. "Forgiveness is the hardest muscle to grow," he said quietly. "Both giving it and accepting it. But like any muscle, it gets stronger with use." George wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed but somehow lighter. The morning progressed with the usual tasks: sweeping, organizing tools, checking inventory. Around noon, Malik arrived, carrying a box of painting supplies. "Uncle Ryder said we're repainting the sign today," he explained, not quite meeting George's eyes. The old wooden sign hanging above the garage had indeed seen better days. The letters were faded, and the wood was weathered gray. Together they set up sawhorses and carefully lowered the sign. As they worked, sanding away years of wear, Malik gradually began to talk. At first it was just comments about the work. "Hand me that sandpaper," or "Watch out for splinters." But as the afternoon wore on, something shifted. "My dad used to do projects like this," Malik said suddenly, his voice soft. "Before Afghanistan. He could fix anything." George paused in his sanding, sensing the weight of the moment. "Sometimes I think people forget he was a person," Malik continued, staring at the sign. "They see the uniform, the flag, the statistics. Another soldier lost. But he was my dad. He taught me to ride a bike in that park over there. He made terrible pancakes every Sunday morning. Malik's voice cracked slightly, and he focused intently on a stubborn patch of old paint. George listened, really listened, in a way he never had before. He saw Malik not as a category or a label, but as a person carrying grief and dreams and memories. A boy who lost his father, who faced prejudice with dignity, who worked hard and helped others despite it all. "I'm tired of being a statistic too," Malik said after a while. "The angry black kid, the fatherless son, the victim in a viral video. I'm just me." "I see you," George said quietly, and he meant it. They worked together through the afternoon, applying fresh paint in careful strokes. The silence between them felt different now, not tense or awkward, but comfortable. Understanding. As evening approached, other bikers began firing up the grills. The smell of chili and cornbread filled the air. Someone had brought an old radio, and country music mingled with the sound of laughter and conversation. George found himself seated on a folding chair between Saint and Malik, a paper plate balanced on his knees. The chili was hot and hearty, the cornbread sweet and crumbly. Around him, bikers shared stories and jokes, their voices warm with fellowship. Looking around at these men, some with prison tattoos, some with military medals, all with stories of redemption, George felt something he'd never experienced in his father's house: belonging. Here, strength wasn't measured by how much you could dominate others, but by how much you could help them. Here, respect wasn't demanded. It was earned through service and humility. The garage sign above them gleamed with fresh paint, a symbol of renewal. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the lot, the laughter and conversation continued to echo. George sat quietly, savoring his food and the moment, finally understanding what real family could feel like. The summer heat pressed down like a heavy blanket as George helped Saint organize boxes of canned goods. 1 week had passed since that evening of cornbread and fellowship, and the garage hummed with its usual activity. The freshly painted sign gleamed in the morning sun, a testament to new beginnings. But peace, as George would learn, could be fragile. The first sign of trouble came with the distant wail of sirens. At first it seemed routine, just another emergency vehicle on the highway. But the sound grew closer, multiplying until it filled the air with urgent screams. Ryder stepped out of his office, his expression dark. "Something's wrong." Before anyone could react, a fleet of police cars and unmarked vehicles swarmed the parking lot, lights flashing in an aggressive display. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, while men in tactical gear positioned themselves around the perimeter. Sheriff Collins emerged from the lead vehicle, a triumphant smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Nobody move!" he bellowed through a megaphone. "This is a raid!" George's heart hammered in his chest as he watched the chaos unfold. The bikers, these men he'd come to respect and care for, were being forced to their knees, rough hands securing handcuffs behind their backs. Saint's weathered face remained stoic, but George could see the pain in his eyes, the old wound of being judged without mercy. "What's going on?" Malik burst through the back door, his voice cracking with panic. "Uncle Ryder." Ryder stood calmly as 2 officers approached him. "It's all right, Malik," he said softly. "Stay calm." Sheriff Collins strode forward, camera crews materializing behind him as if by magic. "Raymond Walsh has been too soft on you boys," he announced, loud enough for the cameras to catch. "We've got evidence of illegal operations running through this establishment. Money laundering, specifically." "That's a lie," Malik shouted, trying to push forward. George grabbed his arm, holding him back. "That's donation money for the food pantry. Everything's documented." But the sheriff just smiled wider, gesturing to his men. They began tearing through the garage, upending boxes of donations and scattering paperwork. Cans of food rolled across the concrete floor. A box of children's clothes spilled open, tiny shoes and sweaters trampled under heavy boots. George's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, scrolling to his father's number. Surely the chief would help. Surely he'd see this was wrong. "Dad," he said when the line connected, his voice trembling. "They're raiding the garage. Sheriff Collins, he's arresting everyone. You have to help." There was a long pause on the other end. When Chief Walsh spoke, his voice was cold. "Let them face the law they ignored." "But Dad, you're coming home, now." The line went dead. George stared at his phone in disbelief, watching as Ryder was led away in handcuffs. The man who'd taught him about real strength, about mercy and redemption, gave him one final nod before being pushed into a police car. "This isn't right," George whispered. Malik stood beside him, shoulders shaking with barely contained rage and grief. "They're going to destroy everything. All the work we do, all the people we help, they don't care." Around them, the garage that had become a sanctuary was being torn apart. Officers carried out boxes of documents, computers, and the lockbox where they kept donation money. Camera crews filmed everything, their hungry lenses capturing the spectacle for the evening news. The drive home felt endless. George's mind raced with images: Saint's resigned expression, Malik's anguish, Ryder's quiet dignity. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the sun was setting, painting the sky in angry shades of red. Inside, he found his mother kneeling beside her bed, hands clasped in prayer. Her whispered words carried down the hallway. "Lord, please let truth prevail. Please protect those men." In the living room, his father paced in front of the TV, where news coverage of the raid played on repeat. "Serves them right," Chief Walsh muttered. "Can't trust their kind. Never could." George slipped past without a word, climbing the stairs to his room. He closed the door and sank onto his bed, pulling out his phone. His gallery was full of photos now, moments captured over the past weeks. There was Saint teaching him how to tune an engine, Malik and him washing bikes side by side. The whole crew gathered around the grill, faces lit with genuine smiles. These weren't criminals. They were men who'd found redemption and dedicated their lives to helping others. Men who'd shown him what real strength looked like. Men who'd saved him from becoming something ugly and small. Looking at those photos, George felt something crystallize in his chest. These men had stood by him when he was at his worst. They'd shown him patience, wisdom, and grace. They'd helped him find his way back to humanity. "They saved me," he whispered in the darkness of his room. "I'll save them." The words felt like a covenant, a sacred promise. Outside his window, the night pressed close, full of uncertainty and fear. But George knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't abandon these men who'd never abandoned him. In the distance, sirens still wailed, and somewhere in the county jail, his friends sat in cells, branded as criminals once again. But tomorrow would bring a new fight, and George Walsh, no longer the angry boy who'd spit hate in a school hallway, would stand for truth. The photos on his phone glowed softly in the dark, each one a testament to transformation, each one a reason to fight, each one a reminder that redemption, once given, demanded to be shared. The morning after the raid dawned gray and heavy. George's footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalk as he walked to school alone, his backpack feeling heavier than usual. The familiar route now seemed different, shadowed by everything that had happened. Students parted like water as he entered the hallway. Whispers followed him, sharp and cutting. "Did you hear about the bikers?" "Criminals, just like everyone said. Can't believe Walsh was hanging out with them." George kept his head up, though each word stung. Near his locker, he caught sight of Malik standing alone, shoulders tight with tension. Their eyes met across the crowded hall. Malik gave him a slight nod, a gesture of solidarity that meant more than words could say. First period dragged by in a blur of unfocused lectures and sideways glances. George couldn't concentrate. His mind kept returning to the garage, to the scattered donations, to Ryder being led away in handcuffs. By lunchtime, the weight of silence had become unbearable. In the cafeteria, George sat at an empty table, pulling out his phone. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the camera app. For a moment, he stared at his own reflection on the screen, barely recognizing the person looking back at him. Gone was the arrogant boy who'd spit on a classmate. In his place sat someone different, someone who'd learned about strength and humility from the most unexpected teachers. He pressed record. "My name is George Walsh," he began, his voice shaky but growing stronger, "and I need to tell you the truth about the Southern Brotherhood Riders." The words poured out of him, honest and raw. He described the early mornings unloading food donations, the quiet wisdom of men society had written off, the gentle way they helped elderly widows with their groceries. He talked about their faith, their patience, their unwavering commitment to serving others. "These men," George said, emotion thick in his throat. "They took a kid full of hate and taught him about love. They showed me what real strength looks like, not in fists or cruel words, but in serving others, in admitting when you're wrong, in choosing mercy over judgment." A shadow fell across his phone screen. George looked up to find Malik standing there, expression determined. Without a word, Malik sat down beside him. "Keep recording," Malik said quietly. George nodded, adjusting the frame to include them both. "My uncle Ryder Thompson leads the Southern Brotherhood Riders," Malik began, his calm voice carrying authority. "After my father died in Afghanistan, Uncle Ryder became my rock. He taught me that pain doesn't have to turn into bitterness. The garage isn't just a place, it's a sanctuary where broken people learn to heal by helping others." Students had started gathering around their table, phones out, recording their own videos of the testimony. George and Malik kept talking, sharing story after story. The Christmas toy drive for foster kids, the midnight runs to help stranded motorists, the weekly dinners where former enemies became brothers. "Everything they seized yesterday," Malik continued, "that was documented. Every donation, every penny spent. We keep records because we believe in accountability, because we're not hiding anything." By final period, their video had already begun spreading across social media. Local news notifications pinged on phones throughout the school. Police chief's son defends accused bikers. Local teen challenges narrative about biker charity group. When the final bell rang, George walked out to find 2 news vans parked in front of the school. Reporters clustered on the sidewalk, microphones ready. "George, can you tell us more about your experience with the Southern Brotherhood Riders?" "Malik, how do you respond to allegations of money laundering?" George and Malik stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the cameras. They repeated their stories, this time with even more conviction. Other students joined them, sharing their own experiences of the bikers' kindness. Across town, in his office at the police station, Chief Raymond Walsh watched the viral video on his computer screen. His son's face filled the display, speaking with a passion and integrity that made his chest tight. The boy he'd raised to fear and judge was standing up for what he believed in, regardless of the cost. Raymond minimized the video window and stared at his reflection in the dark screen. The face looking back at him seemed older, tired. How long had he let fear guide his decisions? How many times had he chosen prejudice over understanding? As evening approached, he drove his patrol car slowly past the garage. The parking lot was filled with cars and people. Townsfolk were arriving with boxes. the confiscated supplies being returned by those who'd kept them safe. Through the open garage doors, he could see George and Malik working side by side, unloading donations and restoring order to the chaos. Ryder Thompson stood nearby, recently released on bail, directing volunteers with quiet authority. The biker leader looked up, somehow sensing Raymond's presence. Their eyes met across the lot, the chief of police and the ex-con who'd taught his son about grace. For the first time, Raymond saw past the leather and tattoos. He saw what George had seen, a man of wisdom and compassion, someone who'd turned his own redemption into a mission to help others find theirs. George appeared in the garage doorway, carrying a heavy box. He paused when he spotted his father's patrol car, his expression a mix of defiance and hope. In that moment, father and son looked at each other without the barrier of anger that had stood between them for so long. The evening light caught the tears in George's eyes, but he stood straight and tall, unashamed. He was no longer the boy desperate for his father's approval. He had become his own man, one who understood that true strength lay in standing up for what was right, even when it meant standing against those you loved. The days following George's video brought a wave of change to the small Georgia town. One by one, the Southern Brotherhood riders were released from custody as community members came forward with evidence of their legitimate charity work. Local business owners provided security footage showing the bikers delivering food and supplies. Church leaders testified about their partnership in holiday outreach programs. Even school teachers spoke up about the group's mentoring efforts. The garage, which had been left in disarray after the raid, became a symbol of community healing. Early morning sun found volunteers arriving with tools and supplies, ready to help rebuild. Mrs. Johnson from the Baptist Church brought homemade biscuits. Mr. Peters, who owned the hardware store, donated lumber and paint. The garage that had once seemed so intimidating to outsiders now buzzed with the sound of hammers and friendly chatter. George worked alongside everyone else, his muscles aching but his heart full. He was hauling wooden beams when he spotted a familiar patrol car pulling into the lot. His father, still in his police uniform, stepped out and stood awkwardly by his vehicle, looking around at the bustling work site. The conversations quieted. Tools lowered. Everyone watched as Chief Raymond Walsh walked slowly towards the damaged wall section, picked up a hammer from a nearby toolbox, and began working without a word. George held his breath, watching his father work methodically, driving nails with precise strikes. The chief's face was unreadable, but his presence spoke volumes. Gradually, the other volunteers resumed their tasks, though many cast curious glances at the police chief now working among them. When lunchtime arrived, Martha Walsh appeared with several large coolers of sandwiches and sweet tea. The workers gathered in groups, sitting on overturned buckets and truck beds, sharing food and stories. George noticed his father sitting alone, and then saw Ryder Thompson approach him with 2 plates. "Mind if I join you, Chief?" Ryder's voice carried across the quiet garage. Raymond Walsh looked up, hesitated, then nodded. "Your garage? Your rules." Ryder sat down, handed the chief a plate, and for a few moments they ate in silence. George edged closer, pretending to sort through a toolbox while straining to hear their conversation. "You know," Ryder began, his voice low and thoughtful, "there was a time I wouldn't have let a cop within 50 feet of this place. Spent 15 years hating everything that badge represented." The chief stiffened, but remained silent. "Faith changed that," Ryder continued. "Taught me that holding on to hate was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Had to learn to love my enemies, even when they didn't love me back." Raymond Walsh set down his sandwich, his shoulders heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been wrong about a lot of things, about you, about this place." He paused, struggling. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air like summer heat. Ryder nodded slowly, accepting the apology with quiet dignity. As afternoon faded into evening, most volunteers headed home, leaving behind a garage that looked markedly better than it had that morning. George found Malik sitting on the tailgate of his uncle's pickup truck, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. George hoisted himself up to sit beside him, their legs dangling over the edge. For a while, they just sat there, two teenagers who had traveled a long way from that hallway confrontation that felt like a lifetime ago. "Hey," George said finally, his voice thick. "I never properly thanked you for forgiving me. I didn't deserve it. Not after what I did." Malik turned to look at him, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's the point of grace," he said simply. "It's not about deserving it. It's about receiving it and passing it on." The words settled over them like a warm blanket, comfortable and true. Below them, the garage stood as a testament to what could happen when grace overcame pride, when forgiveness trumped fear. The wall George's father had helped repair was solid now, stronger perhaps than before it had been broken. As they sat there, George noticed his father walking toward his patrol car. The chief paused, looking back at the garage, at his son, at the scene of sunset peace. For a moment their eyes met, and George saw something new there, not the stern authority he'd grown up fearing, but a glimmer of understanding, of change, of hope. The garage's transformation mirrored the town's healing. Over the following weeks, the fresh paint dried, new shelves went up, and the sign above the door proudly displayed Heaven's Riders Outreach in bold letters. The name Change marked more than just a new beginning. It symbolized the bridge being built between different parts of their community. On a warm Saturday evening, strings of twinkling lights crisscrossed the parking lot as townspeople gathered for the grand reopening. Folding chairs filled quickly, and the aroma of barbecue and fresh-baked pies drifted through the air. George stood at the makeshift podium, his hands trembling slightly as he faced the crowd. "A few months ago," he began, his voice growing steadier, "I stood in a school hallway and made the worst choice of my life. I let hate and pride guide my actions." He paused, swallowing hard. "But these men, these bikers everyone was so quick to judge, they showed me what real strength looks like. It looks like forgiveness, like serving others, like loving your enemies." In the crowd, his mother wiped tears from her eyes. Several rows back, Sheriff Collins sat quietly, his face flushed with shame. The next morning, his resignation letter would appear on the mayor's desk. After George's speech, Malik's mother approached him, wrapping him in a tight embrace. "You've made peace where pain lived," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The evening flowed into a celebration of community. George helped serve plates of food to over 100 guests, moving between tables with growing confidence. The bikers treated him like family, affectionately calling out Brother George whenever they passed by. As night settled in, the string lights cast a warm glow over tables of people who had once been strangers, now sharing meals, stories, and laughter. Prayers of thanksgiving rose into the evening air, and hope spread through the town like an old hymn, familiar and sweet. The late summer sun painted the streets gold as George guided his modest motorcycle through the familiar roads of town. The bike, a thoughtful gift from Ryder and the Brotherhood, hummed steadily beneath him. His leather jacket felt comfortable now, the patch on the back declaring Brotherhood over hate, catching the sunlight. Pulling into Heaven's Riders Outreach, George smiled at the sight of Malik bent over a small bicycle, teaching a neighborhood kid how to adjust the chain. The garage had become more than just a repair shop. It was a sanctuary of second chances. "Looking good there, Professor Thompson," George called out, dismounting his bike. Malik straightened up, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. They shared a knowing grin before clasping hands in their usual greeting, a handshake that carried the weight of their journey from enemies to friends. The crunch of gravel announced another arrival. Chief Walsh stepped out of his patrol car, his uniform crisp but his manner softer than before. He walked over to George, placing a weathered hand on his son's shoulder. "Your old man's proud of you," he said quietly, the words carrying more meaning than any long speech could. Soon after, the rumble of motorcycles filled the air as the Brotherhood gathered for their weekly charity ride. George took his place among them, the engines roaring to life in perfect harmony. As they rode through town, past waving neighbors and smiling faces, George felt the truth in his heart. They said punishment would change me, he thought, as they headed toward the golden horizon. But it wasn't punishment. It was love dressed in leather and mercy. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.